Thank the clerk. I call the question is that this bill be agreed to. I call the member for Dawson.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Agricultural and Veterinary Chemicals Legislation Amendment, removing reapproval and re-registration Bill 2014. And Mr Deputy Speaker, controlling pests is an essential ingredient of agriculture. Deloitte Access Economics recently attributed 68% of crop production to the use of ag-vet chemicals. That's an important point, because if we were to remove these chemicals from use on farms, we would be increasing the price of food on the grocery store shelf. It's a simple equation. Any increase in time or money taken to produce crops translates to dollars at the checkout for households. Any reduction in the amount a farmer can produce also translates into extra dollars at the checkout. When we don't see those costs flow through to consumer, we see farmers go out of business, and one way or the other, families end up paying more. This amendment is about ensuring farmers spend more time producing our food and less time bound up in red tape. With this amendment, we are implementing our election commitment to remove the requirement for agricultural chemicals and veterinary medicines re-registration by removing end dates for approvals and last renewal dates for registration, so that approvals will no longer end after a particular period. By allowing registrations to be renewed perpetually, this amendment is the reform that's needed to reduce red tape by providing for less frequent registration renewals, to improve the APVMA's ability to secure information about the safety of chemicals supplied in the market, to introduce further simple reforms to ag-vet chemicals regulation to reduce red tape and improve efficiency once again, to oblige the APVMA to provide access to information about approvals and registration in its files to persons eligible to receive it, and to address some minor implementation issues identified in the existing reform legislation. This is a good amendment that will keep farmers farming and free up the APVMA to get on with its job. Before the Greens start wringing their hands and making their wild claims about the world exploding in a puff of fairy dust, let me point out this, Mr Deputy Speaker. Removing the regular registration requirement does not mean that there will be any less oversight of chemical use in the industry. In fact, no longer faced with the onerous task of constant re-registration, the APVMA will have more time to work on creating and analysing real scientific information to better inform their processes. The APVMA will retain its existing powers to ensure any newly identified risks about safety, efficacy or trade impact of a chemical are examined. The APVMA also retains the power to recall unsafe chemical products or suspend or cancel the registration of a product if they no longer meet the criteria for registration. These powers were actually strengthened and streamlined by a recent amendment to the Act, which makes me wonder why the provision for regular re-registration was actually created in the first place, because it achieves absolutely nothing. If the APVMA discovers through credible scientific evidence that there is a particular problem with the chemical, it has the power to act. It already had that power to act. It always did, and it still does. Let's just imagine for a moment, though, that the process that the Green influence is suggesting would happen if a problem was discovered with the use of a particular chemical. Let's assume there was a pesticide that farmers used to remove green stains from their property. What is the APVMA going to do if they discover that this green-away pesticide comes with a dangerous side effect? Are they going to wait until it's time to re-register it to say, oh no, we've discovered a couple of years ago that using this pesticide makes your arms fall off or results in a social media meltdown or whatever comes of it, and so we aren't going to re-register it? Well, that wouldn't be a protection. It is just another gate that the Green movement can use to attack farmers and any productive enterprise that uses such chemicals. We have already seen the FAO environmental movement employ similar gatekeeper tactics to sabotage the sugar industry with the effective ban on diuron, which I'll come to in a minute. The interesting thing about this re-registration provision is when it was introduced by Labor and the Greens, The interesting thing was the rhetoric around the issue before that legislation was actually introduced into this place. In 2010, Labor's then Agriculture Minister, Senator Joe Ludwig, he was a genius that was behind hamstringing the cattle industry, and Labor's Minister on Assisting Deregulation, Nick Sherry, they issued a joint press release that was spruiking the Gillard government's continuing to reform the regulation and use off-farm chemicals and veterinary drugs to help improve productivity and international competitiveness in the agricultural sector. That's a quote right out of their press release. But the following year, on the 4th of March 2011, the then Minister Ludwig outlined the reasons why reform was necessary. He said, ineffective and inefficient chemical regulation can lead to problems such as higher costs to business, higher costs and reduced choice for chemical users, and potential for reduced community confidence in the system as a whole. Well, hallelujah, the Labor Party got it, or so we thought. But what happened? What happened? What happened between those statements, which were supported by industry, and the passing of the legislation by the previous government in June last year? What happened? What happened? Because the legislation introduced ineffective and inefficient chemical regulation, which, according to Labor's former Agriculture Minister, as he said in an initial press release, can lead to problems such as higher costs to businesses, higher costs and reduced choice for chemical users, and the potential for reduced community confidence in the system as a whole. Well, I'll tell you what happened, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Greens happened. It seems, the Greens happened. They influenced the Labor Party in this place to come up with this ridiculous legislation. It seems that the APVMA, sad to say, is also overly susceptible to Green campaigns, whether or not they're backed by credible science or just emotional claptrap. And such was the case with diuron. The chemical diuron is actually an essential part of the sugar industry. It's an extremely effective form of weed control, and it's been responsible for increased efficiencies and production within that industry. It's also been the subject of a very sloppy scientific review and a consequent lack of consultation on that review. At no point did the APVMA consider the impact on agriculture and what decisions mean in the real world when it comes to the banning of diuron. Now, if the Greens think that a chemical might be suspect, then Labor, when they were in government, was simply happy to let the APVMA ban it, or at least regulate it to the point of effectively being banned. No proper scientific studies were carried out on the use of diuron in the North Queensland sugar industry. No one consulted with the North Queensland sugar industry. No one thought about what would happen to the industry if that chemical was banned. No one bothered to consider if there were viable alternatives. No one thought about what the North Queensland sugar industry farmers would have to do if the product was off the shelves. And no one can definitively show that there will be any overall benefit from the ban on the product. The sugar farmers in North Queensland are acutely aware of their impact on the environment, the land and the waterways, and the quality that they need to maintain in the environment, the land and the waterways. Their entire business, their livelihoods, are based on the quality of the environment, the quality of the land, the quality of the waterways. In recent generations, we've seen an increasing focus in the sugar industry on sustainable practice, and cane farmers right throughout North Queensland have adopted a range of environmental practices that provide very good outcomes for both the environment and the industry. And these new environmental practices, such as green trash blanketing and in conjunction with the use of chemicals like diuron, have proved to be very, very effective. Now, if diuron is removed from the process, the environmental practices are no longer effective for the industry. So is that the result that the Greens, who are pushing for this product to be banned, were wanting to see? Did they want to see a return to those old practices, such as the burning off of cane trash? Did the APVMA, the Greens, or those opposite, for 1 minute consider what the alternative practice would actually be and what impact that would have on the environment? They bothered to ask anyone in the sugar industry what would happen if diuron was no longer available for use. Well, there is no economically viable alternative to diuron. The regulator has placed restrictions on diuron use to concentrations that actually render it ineffective, or they've banned its use in the precise time when the farmers actually need to use it for weed management. No consideration was given to the development of an economically viable alternative before banning what essentially was an industry-standard weed management tool. Now, representing the largest sugar-growing electorate in this country, I'm acutely aware of the impact that such rash decisions can have on this key industry. But I also represent the Bowen-Gumlu region, which is the largest winter-growing region for capsicums and tomatoes in Australia. The region produces 47,000 tonnes of capsicum and chilies, worth an estimated $100 million. This small region in North Queensland produces 95% of our capsicums during September and October, and it also produces $124 million worth of tomatoes every year. It accounts for 90% of the nation's production of tomatoes between September and October. Now, the Bowen-Gumlu region also produces many other different sort of horticultural products, and what was important for all of that was an organophosphate insecticide called dimethoate for controlling fruit fly. The APVMA conducted a review on the use of dimethoate, and it found it could pose a potential dietary risk to consumers. In 2011, they lowered the maximum residue limit for dimethoate pesticide from 0.02 milligrams per kilogram per day to 0.001 milligrams per kilogram per day. Now, not content with strangling agricultural production in the domestic market, the APVMA by default there, with that decision, forced their new restrictive standards onto the New Zealand market as well, because a lot of these tomatoes go over to New Zealand. Despite the fact that New Zealand has its own regulatory regime for agricultural chemicals, and in fact actually allows the use of diuron to the levels that we've now banned in Australia, the APVMA chose to effectively make this decision which blocks the export of Australian tomatoes to New Zealand because there's no alternative in control of the fruit fly. Even though the tomatoes and the dimethoate use met the standards for New Zealand, they no longer meet Australian standards because Australian standards, I've got to say, have been abducted by extremists. But they met the standards for New Zealand, you know, this bastion of environmentalism right on our doorstep. But by effectively blocking the export of these tomatoes to New Zealand, the APVMA cost Australian growers important market share. The industry had developed alternative means of fruit fly control. They've gone through this rigorous process and they've finally got there, but it's taken an extraordinary amount of effort, extraordinary amount of time to process all the applications through all the different states to get this new method accepted, and you know, they still haven't got there in terms of getting New Zealand to accept it. And 2 years of opportunity, market access has been lost. When farmers from my electorate could not export into New Zealand, alternatives were sought in New Zealand. When the door was slammed to Australian farmers, a door was opened for the Netherlands on the other side of the world to take our place. And now New Zealand farmers, encouraged by the increased price opportunity, because obviously higher transport costs coming from the Netherlands, and left with our undersupply or our non-supply, have now started building greenhouses to enable them to permanently take over the market share that we once had. That's what happens. The agriculture industry in Australia today faces a framework of reasons not to succeed. We have organisations, regulators and eco-terrorists looking for opportunities to interfere, to frustrate, to block and to exert their influence. What agriculture needs is a proactive framework that celebrates its strengths, encourages success and seeks resolution and positive outcomes. We have seen enough of Labor and the Greens asking, how can we slow this down? It's time for the government to say, instead of how can we slow, how can we grow? The Liberal National Government meets an important election commitment with this amendment. We made a specific commitment to agriculture sector to repeal these counterproductive measures from chemical regulation, and I've got to say, I think we need to go further than that. I think that the Radical Greens, who have now gotten this foot in the door with the APVMA, there needs to be something put up, a barrier against that. And what I do propose, and I hope eventually it will come to place, is that we give right of veto to the minister to some of the decisions that the APVMA makes. But that may be legislation for another day. The bill that we have before us today will remove the senseless red tape that was introduced last year and will allow a viable agricultural industry to get on with the job. Mr Deputy Speaker, for all of these reasons, I commend the bill to the House.